Orthodox Christianity is the complete monstrous inversion of all that the New Testament stands for.
From Portland, Oregon, Verdict Publications presents its 1987 summer seminar, Farewell to Religion, with Verdict editor Robert D. Brinsmead. An Australian entrepreneur, Mr. Brinsmead has lectured extensively on 5 continents and is a lay theologian. In this session, he speaks on the challenge of a new beginning.
Well, thank you very much for your welcome. I'm very conscious of the fact that this is the 4th of July weekend, and I was trying to think of something suitable for such a weekend, like something non-controversial and maybe sentimental. So I chose for my title of our series for the weekend, the subject, Farewell to Religion, a Manifesto of Christian Atheism. As a visitor to this country, I'm often impressed, even stunned, at the all-pervasiveness of religion in this country. Will Herberg, philosopher, theologian, once said, "Americans believe in religion as no other people." We all know that religion is given special status in this country. For instance, it's tax exempt. I know that one of the great problems in this country is balancing the budget. I was listening to Reagan the other night. I was going, if I had the opportunity, I might make a brilliant suggestion how to balance the budget. Maybe to remove the tax-exempt status of religion. The nation could certainly raise a lot of revenue. But on every hand, it is felt that religion is a good thing. It's maybe the element that makes this nation great. Presidential leaders from Dwight Eisenhower to Reagan could be cited as eulogising religion as the cohesive element, as the thing that is vital to this nation's destiny. Now, since this is the 4th of July, I thought it'd be interesting to compare such statements from leaders of this country with the Founding Fathers and their estimate of religion. You know, these Founding Fathers are great men who stalk across the landscape of history about 10 feet tall. And often their statements are gathered up as sort of gems of wisdom for future generations. And I thought it'd be very interesting to read some of the statements of these Founding Fathers. First of all, Thomas Jefferson. This is what he said: "I do not find in Orthodox Christianity one redeeming feature. The greatest enemies of Jesus are the doctrines and creeds of the Church. It would be more pardonable to believe in no God at all than to blaspheme him by the atrocious writings of the theologians." Hardly a great recommendation. I remember standing in the great Jefferson Memorial some years ago in Washington, D.C., and there, written around the dome of that great memorial, are the words of Jefferson: "I swear on the altar of God eternal hostility over every form of enslavement over the mind of man." When we understand what Jefferson stood for, we can appreciate that one of those elements that called forth his hostility was indeed the Christian religion. Now, James Madison, he said, "During almost 15 centuries, the legal establishment known as Christianity has been on trial. And what has been the fruits, more or less, in all places? These are the fruits: pride, indolence, ignorance and arrogance in the clergy, ignorance, arrogance and civility in the laity, and in both clergy and laity, superstition, bigotry and persecution. George Washington didn't appear either to have much regard for religion. It is reported that he refused to take communion, and when he went to church he refused to kneel, although his adopted daughter recorded that he communed with his God in secret. John Adams became so disenchanted with the religious baggage of Christianity that he wrote, "Nowhere in the Gospels do we find a precept for creeds, confessions, oaths, doctrines, and a whole carload of other foolish trumpery that we find Christianity encumbered with." And Abraham Lincoln, he tersely declared, "Christianity is not my religion. I could never give assent to the long, complicated statements of Christian dogma." In our day, there's a growing unease, even among Christians themselves, concerning the Christian religion. I don't think it's a matter of so much of Christians standing outside throwing stones at the church, but rather of trying to fulfill the injunction of the Apostle Paul: if you criticise yourself, you will not come under a heavier judgment. In that recent book by Ellul, the French scholar, The Subversion of Christianity, he sets forth the amazing thesis that historic Christianity, the Christian religion as we know it, is the complete opposite of what Jesus and the apostles were about. And then he makes the amazing statement, "I'm not talking," he said, "just about a few points, I'm talking about every point." And then he made the rather unflattering statement about religious professionalism, or religious professionals, which he called a highly respected social class. And he said their task is to make of Christianity the very opposite of what it really is. If Ellul is anywhere near correct, and I have a suspicion that he might be, I find it very difficult to avoid the appalling conclusion that Christianity must be the great Antichrist. Now, in order to soften the blow of that just a little bit, and to sort of point out how it's not really such an outrageous statement, it's really quite a mild statement. We may remember that that sort of observation is nothing new. Luther said something similar in his day, and although it wasn't really a polemic against the Pope, although sometimes he did have polemics against the Pope, it was rather Luther's insight that the great enemy of Christ, the great Antichrist, is not something outside the Christian movement. It always necessarily is something that must arise among the followers of Christ. And Kierkegaard, the Dutch philosopher-theologian of the last century, basically said the same thing. In his day, somewhere about 100 years ago, here was this man crying out, and hardly anyone listened to him in his day. It's only since that he's become a tremendous influence in philosophy and in theology. But he made the startling observation in his day that Orthodox Christianity is the complete monstrous inversion of all that the New Testament stands for. Let me use a couple of illustrations from outside the Christian movement. to illustrate that the danger, of course, the anti must always come, by the very nature of the case, the anti-element must always come from the followers of the movement. Supposing today Karl Marx, the father of Marxism, would rise from the dead, what do you think would disturb him most in looking around to see the perversion of what he really, in his idealism, what he really wanted? Do you think he would suppose that anti-Marxism would be capitalism? Not at all. Methinks he would clearly see that anti-Marxism might be some of the so-called Marxist regimes in the world today. And of course, leading Marxists, purists, they recognise that quite clearly. You take, for instance, the followers of Luther, and what Luther, the spirit of Luther. There are great Lutheran theologians and thinkers who recognise that the great perversion of Luther, the great anti-Luther, of course, is not from the Anabaptists or from the Catholics and so on, but it is Orthodox Lutheranism. And who else is in the position to betray and to hijack the movement but the followers of the movement? That is, who is always in the position, in the box seat as it were, to betray Christ, but the disciple of Christ, and to hijack Christianity but the followers of Christianity. A Christian missionary once asked Mahatma Gandhi, "Mr. Gandhi, what do you think is the greatest hindrance of the message of Jesus reaching Indians today?" And without a moment hesitation, Gandhi said, "Christianity." On every hand today, thinkers are making the observation that we've reached the end of an era. Malcolm Muggeridge calls it the end of Christendom. Another has called it the end of the Protestant era. The age of Western Christianity, as we have known it, many are saying, is at an end. One has said, well, you either see it or you don't. But on every hand, the viability of not only the institutions as we've known them, but the viability of the great theological edifice, because the philosophic and theological presuppositions upon which they've been constructed are crumbling on every hand. They no longer are viable. There is so much of the whole Christian religion. There is so much of Christian theology that has stood for centuries that today is called into question. And it's really no longer viable. That I want to suggest the simplest thing to do in many respects is to discard it all and start again. Now, I'm conscious of the fact that's rather a little bit idealistic. We're all the product of our culture and of our social and religious context, and that gives us our biases, and really it's not really possible to do that. But at least pretend that we'll make a good honest attempt to do it. Discard it all and start again. And you might say, how? Well, we have a very good lesson, of course, in the very origin of Christianity, because that's really what the first followers of Jesus had to do. And they started right in the rubble and ruins of disaster. Because if you look at the history of events leading up to the death of Christ and read it in its historical context, the death of Christ appears to these followers as an absolute debacle, a disaster, and that's the total end of everything. Now, it all began with the resurrection. The resurrection was the starting point of Christianity. We only have to read the book of Acts to realise that the preaching of the resurrection was the essence of the gospel. That's where it all began. It gave them a new view of everything, a new view of the past, a new view of the Old Testament, a new view of the future. And from this vantage point, they began the development of that movement known as Christianity. And we may view the whole Old Testament, in fact, as a history of that first 2 or 3 generations, as they began to see the implications of this momentous event of the resurrection. And we see progression, and even in the New Testament we see the elements of regression. Some beginning to do some things that were inconsistent with faith in the resurrection. And after the passing of those first generations, we see this regressive element accelerating. Until we see this great inversion. A whole religion, which is really the inverse of what Jesus and the apostles were about. Or to put it another way, we see a religion that is really totally opposite to faith in the resurrection. The very starting point. And so what I suggest we do is take up the challenge of a new beginning. To really honestly try and detach ourselves from our traditions and our presuppositions and start right there as that first Christian community did. And begin to see everything. What does the resurrection mean for this? And what does it mean for that? And how does it determine our direction? And how does it colour and determine our behaviour at every point? Because it's much easier. It's much easier to scrap it all and start again. It reminds me of a young fellow who came to live with us in Australia. We always lived in a kind of a rural setting, and when he came to live in our home, I gave him the job of milking the cow every day. It was something for him to do, and one more job that I could get off from my responsibility. Of course, there was no milking machines, just one cow, milk it by hand, and you know, a cow can be a very messy animal. Milk's not the only thing that comes out of a cow. And unfortunately, everything tends to come out at the one time. And at least from my point of view, I'm very fussy about milk. I just like milk nice and clean. But he used to tend to come in with the bucket looking very, very messy. And I noticed that he didn't like drinking milk. It's like it's like Mum that has to clean the chickens. You see, she doesn't like, she's doing all the gutting, and, you notice she doesn't eat the chicken. Well, I noticed that Matt wasn't drinking the milk. So one day he came in with quite a dirty-looking bucket, and there was flecks of stuff floating around the top of it. And that was too much for me, and I scraped this stuff up, made a nice mixture out of it, put it in the cup. Now I said, you drink it. You expect us to drink it, you stand there and drink it. No, he said, I won't drink it. I said, if you don't drink this, I said, I'll pour it down your throat. So he had to drink it, and I saw that he absolutely abhorred it. It was a terrible thing. He had to drink this stuff. And I could, I could tell you about what I suspected was that stuff was. Well, one day I thought, well, he was a bit slow, and I sort of dropped in to check in, see what he was doing. Now, as you know, that most house cows, a lot of house cows have been brought up as pets and calves, and this one was no exception. And you train them to drink milk from a bucket, and cows, of course, when they've been trained like that, they even like to drink their own milk. And lo and behold, I checked up with Matt to see what he was doing, and do you know what he was doing? He had the whole bucket, there he was holding it up, and the cow's head was in the bucket, and the cow was drinking the milk. What on earth? My hair was just about standing on end. I said, what on earth are you doing? He said, Uncle Bob, he says, I was milking the cow, he said, it put its foot right in the bucket. Now that happens too sometimes. He said, the cow put its foot in the bucket. So he said, I thought, what's the use? So he said, I'm putting it through again. Well, our whole thinking about what is the gospel, I want to suggest we too ought to start right there at the beginning and put it through again. Now, in case you think that might be something very, very dangerous, and I know, theology is sort of a sacred cow sometimes, or at least special points of theology is such a sacred cow. Certain points are regarded as the holies of Christian theology. We shrink back. We're scared to touch it. It's like touching the ark. We might end up like that character in the Old Testament called Uzzah. Look, according to the New Testament, if I can read it in any way, and with what it's saying, and I believe at this point it's crystal clear. Faith that God has raised up the crucified Jesus from the dead is not only the essence of the gospel, but this faith is altogether all-sufficient. And I want to show during this weekend it is altogether and overwhelmingly so all-sufficient that everything else that we may be that we're able to say is really only adding footnotes. To confess, Paul declares in Romans 10, to confess that Jesus is Lord and to believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead is salvation. It is life eternal, it is salvation, it is justification, it is acceptance, it is forgiven, it is any other metaphor about redemption that you might care to sort of spell out. To believe that God has raised up this crucified Jesus from the dead is not only the very essence of the New Testament faith, it is all sufficient. So if it is all sufficient and gives us this all-sufficient forgiveness, acceptance, the open future, security, and everything else, then from this vantage point and this firm foundation, we shall be sort of nerved and given the courage to tackle the great problems and to call into question many things